Now, the CDC is admitting what I have been arguing on this program for about 3 months now, and that is the number of Americans exposed to the Wuhan coronavirus is way, way higher than is being reported. The CDC now says 10 times higher. What does this mean? Well, it means that maybe somewhere around 30% of the population in the United States, possibly much more, has COVID-19 antibodies now. So, what can we conclude from all of this? Death rate dropping, herd immunity growing, younger people contracting asymptomatically. Conclusion? The virus is beginning to die out. It's not a second wave. America is actually winning the war against COVID-19. You're not going to hear this anywhere else, are you? Joining me now from Ottawa, Ontario, Canada, researcher with the Ontario Civil Liberties Association, Denis Rancourt, PhD. Denis, when we look, I was watching Dr. Fauci today during this update of the COVID-19 task force at the White House, and he was wearing his mask. It was not an N95 mask. It was not even a surgical mask. It was one of these little flowery masks that people are buying these days to accentuate their garb. But I was thinking to myself, this guy knows the truth. He knows that masks don't work. He knows the data. He knows what I know. He knows what you know. And this report that I just happened to run into from the League of Women Voters, of all things, talks about it. The use of a cloth mask or the use of a bandana or scarf is not adequate respiratory protection for ongoing exposure to COVID-19. Conceivably, such a mask might be marginally better than a bare face, but there are no real world data to prove this concept. That's the bottom line here, right? Masks, these politicians go and order people to wear a mask, and it makes people feel good, like they're doing something, like they're protecting themselves or maybe protecting others. In reality, it's all a farce.
Well, I mean, masks are just a symbol of compliance, and they're trying to convince us that this virus was particularly deadly or virulent. It was not. This is just a regular cold. If you look at all-cause mortality across the last decade and more, it has not been greater than in previous winter-burdened deaths. So there is no killer here. I mean, the government, no matter what the government does, the only thing that's happened that's really dramatic is a spike in deaths in homes that has been coincident with the announcement of these lockdowns and so on. And that has happened in jurisdictions where they've done that. But except for that artificial spike, which has killed people, accelerated their death needlessly, this is not a particularly virulent seasonal viral respiratory disease. It's not. And it was going to go away in the summer like they all do. They have to, because they are transmitted by aerosol particles, and aerosol particles are not stable in air when the air gets humid. They're only stable in air when you have low absolute humidity, which is in the wintertime. This is well known. It's been known for a decade. The main transmission route is fine aerosol particles that are part of the fluid air. As soon as that cycle comes down, the transmissivity drops by a factor of 5. There is no viral respiratory disease that's going to transmit in the summer. It just doesn't happen. And so it really doesn't matter what the government does during the summer. Now, when the season comes around again, there is a whole host of respiratory viral diseases that are there, ready to pounce on us like they always do. It's unavoidable. There's every variety of them. They're mutating all the time. You're going to call that a pandemic if you want to, but there is going to be a winter burden death rate that's going to come again next season, because there are immune vulnerable people there, and they will be subjected to this. And so there you go. That's what's going to happen.
All right, Denis, I want to unpack some of this because you said a lot there. When you talk about all-cause mortality, effectively, in layman's terms, what you're saying is, if the COVID-19 virus was so deadly, we would see on a graph, we would see a spike in all deaths globally, not just in the United States, but globally. But we can look in the microcosm of the United States. We would see a spike there, and you look at the numbers, you don't see the spike, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it a spike. It's the winter burden, so it's a regular hump. It's relatively broad. It takes many weeks to develop, and then many weeks to die down. And the total area under that curve is the winter burden mortality, and it has not statistically been greater than for the last many decades.
Okay, so we have
there was no killer event. This is completely fabricated. There is no special virus that has been more virulent than other viruses in other seasons or anything like that. It has been a propaganda exercise to sell vaccines, as far as I can tell, and to make us afraid, and to test to what extent we're willing to tolerate having our lives controlled.
Well,
that's all this has been.
The reason it varies, Denis, you're in Canada. So
Yes.
you look at things from a different political perspective than I do, and I look at this as potentially the greatest conspiracy that's ever transpired in America. And of course, America kind of drives what the rest of the world does. I firmly believe, and I'll take this to my grave, that this was an attempt to crush the economy of the United States in order to crush the re-election chances of Donald Trump. That's another discussion you and I can have. You're a scientist. I'm just giving you a different perspective on it. But the politicians are ignoring the facts. That's the bottom line. They're cherry picking and they're ignoring the facts. And so we get this crazy reporting from the mainstream media. They're peddling this propaganda. This report just dropped today. It says this. I want your reaction to this, Denis. If 95% of Americans wore a face mask in public, it could prevent 33,000 deaths by October 1st, according to the University of Washington's Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation. This is a lie. This is an out-and-out lie. They're just making this stuff up.
It's complete nonsense. It's complete nonsense. There have been, many very serious randomized controlled trials with verified outcomes where they actually measure if you're infected or not. And they all conclude the same thing, which is wearing a mask versus not wearing a mask, or even a respirator, does not change your risk of being infected by a viral respiratory disease, period. The science is now conclusive. If there was any advantage in those terms, it would have showed up in at least one of these trials. And it does not.
And I see.
And it's worse than that, because it's actually worse than that, because if you recommend masks into the general public, there are many real dangers associated with that.
Well, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that because I bring this up every time I see a worker at a young person in particular, in their 20s, they're wearing a mask. I say this is criminal. And young kids wearing masks, this is absolutely criminal. So let us count the ways it is criminal. You talk about something in your publications about a loaded mask, and that sounds like what it is, and that is loaded with all kinds of germs. But not only that, it's just common sense. It's what my grandmother would tell me. If I have a face covering all day long, I'm breathing my own CO2, I'm depriving my body of the proper amount of oxygen, and that can lead to real problems.
Absolutely, and the studies show that healthcare workers, one of the biggest studies that did it seriously, the only outcome they were able to find is that the healthcare workers were getting many more headaches. That was statistically significant, but they couldn't find any advantage in terms of reducing that risk of being infected.
All right.
Okay. So, and this is repeated over and over again. I don't know how many studies they're going to need before they start admitting this, but instead they keep looking for a small effect.
And one of the reasons is that masks don't work is because of the size, and I don't want you to dive too deep into this because I only have about a minute left, Denis, but it does have to do with the size of the particle of the aerosol of the COVID-19, and there's more research on this, but effectively that the COVID-19 can be smaller or small enough to permeate most, if not all, masks. Would you argue with that?
Well, all these viral respiratory diseases, they all work the same way. They're transmitted through the finest fraction of aerosol particles that are in fluid suspension in the air. Those particles follow the flow of air. In any mask, you're always going to have a non-perfect seal because of the imperfections of your skin or whatever, and that is where the lowest impedance is for the airflow. That's where those particles are going to come in, and they're going to come out equally well. So none of these masks can work. And besides, when you're breathing, just the positive pressure pushes the mask away. You know, there's all kinds of effects. The point is, though, when you do these careful studies, you never see that it helps. And this is the reason, because it's got to be because of the transmission mechanism.
Right.
We know it's aerosol particles. We know they're coming in and they're getting out. It's that, you know, that you can't get around that. Now, it's not about the size of the virion, which is the virus particle itself, because it's usually within a droplet, but that droplet can be very small, and it can be completely transported in the air. This is why these diseases go deeply into your lungs, because they're transported by these particles and they go straight into your lungs. That's how it's transmitted, that's how you get infected. That's where your immune system has to act to protect you. This is all very well-known stuff. So masks are proven not to work, and when you think about the physics, they shouldn't work.
One last thing, symbolically speaking, it's a horrible act of submission, and especially in the United States, where we have this crazy thing called the First Amendment. It is muzzling people. I can't understand at a grocery store when the clerk is talking, I can't understand a word they're saying because they're muzzled, and this is, to me, is the worst part of a mandate to wear a mask. Denis, thank you for your research. Coming up next,